The morning was cool and quiet, a typical day in the backwoods of Redwood Ridge, where the air still held the crisp promise of early fall. I trudged outside with a steaming mug of coffee in hand, ready for a day of tending to my little homestead. As I ambled toward the woodpile, I stopped dead in my tracks. My firewood was gone. Not just a few logs, but the entire stack that I'd painstakingly split, stacked, and left by the porch for winter's chill. A sinking feeling hit me like a freight train. Who would dare steal my firewood? Within moments, whispers began circulating among the neighbors. It wasn't long before I discovered that the culprit was none other than Karen, affectionately and infamously known in Redwood Ridge as HOA Karen. Ever since she moved into the neighborhood, Karen had made it her personal crusade to enforce every rule in the book, even if it meant overstepping personal boundaries. Apparently, in her eyes, my humble pile of firewood was not only an eyesore, but a violation of some obscure HOA guideline that dictated proper property maintenance. I couldn't believe it. I had worked hard to gather that firewood during the late summer, splitting logs by hand and stacking them neatly to prepare for the winter. To think that Karen, with her clipboard and self-appointed authority, would stoop so low as to steal it from my property, an act that smacked of petty tyranny, filled me with a righteous anger that was impossible to ignore. I knew I had to do something drastic. As I fumed over the injustice, a mischievous idea began to form. If Karen was going to meddle with my property, I'd give her a taste of her own medicine. What if I could replace my stolen firewood with something far more troublesome? And then it hit me. Fire ants. I recalled how, during a recent foray into the woods, I'd come across a log teeming with fire ants, a natural phenomenon I'd almost forgotten amid the hustle of homestead life. In that charged moment, with my coffee long forgotten on the porch, I resolved to turn the tables. I would secretly gather a few of those logs and carefully introduce fire ants into them, then stack them in place of my stolen firewood. When Karen, or anyone else, tried to claim or use my firewood, they would instead be met with a stingy, buzzing surprise. It was a plan born of equal parts indignation and creative retribution. Today, Karen's meddling was going to come back to bite her in the most unexpected and painful way possible. 2. Introduction of characters and setting. Approximately 600 words. Redwood Ridge was a patchwork of rural charm and stubborn independence, a place where sprawling lawns met wild, untamed woods, and every home had a story etched in weathered wood and worn stone. Nestled on the outskirts of town, my little homestead was a testament to generations of hard work. I'd inherited this piece of land from my grandfather, who taught me the value of self-reliance and respect for nature. Here, among the tall pines and winding dirt roads, I lived a simple life, tending to my animals, maintaining the garden, and gathering firewood for the long winter months. But not everyone in Redwood Ridge cherished that same independent spirit. The local homeowners association had long been a source of conflict in our tight-knit community. Its members prided themselves on a pristine, uniform appearance, enforcing rules with an iron grip that left little room for personal expression. At the heart of that bureaucracy stood Karen Benson, affectionately dubbed HOA Karen by residents who had learned to dread her clipboard and her endless list of complaints. Karen wasn't the official president of the HOA, but her relentless vigilance and propensity for micromanagement had given her an unofficial status that bordered on tyranny. Karen was a woman in her late 40s with an unwavering belief in order and uniformity. Every day, she could be seen patrolling the neighborhood streets, smartphone in hand, ready to report any deviation from her rigid vision of perfection. To her, every stray branch, every unsightly structure, and every piece of property that didn't conform to the rules was a personal affront. Her latest transgression, stealing my firewood, was just another chapter in her ongoing campaign to police Redwood Ridge. I, on the other hand, was a man who valued authenticity over conformity. My life on the homestead was a blend of modern convenience and old-world tradition. I cherished the freedom to live on my own terms, and I wasn't about to let anyone, not even HOA Karen, dictate how I managed my property. My days were filled with the simple pleasures of rural living, tending to my garden, caring for my animals, and, yes, splitting logs to keep my home warm during the winter. The firewood was not just fuel for the fireplace. It was a symbol of my hard work and the legacy of a family that had built its life from the land. The setting of Redwood Ridge was as dramatic as it was picturesque. Rolling fields bordered dense woods, and every season brought a new burst of color to the landscape. Despite its natural beauty, the area was not without its tensions. The HOA's influence had grown over the years, imposing a strict code that clashed with the free-spirited nature of the countryside. While many of my neighbors grudgingly accepted the rules in exchange for community amenities, I had always chafed at the notion that my property and my way of life could be regulated by a handful of self-appointed enforcers. So when the HOA's letter arrived, declaring that my ranch was to be partially managed as community land due to a technicality in the zoning regulations, I knew I had reached a breaking point. It wasn't just about a stolen stack of firewood. It was about the encroachment of bureaucratic control on my private domain. My home, my land, was my sanctuary, a place of freedom where the rules of nature and tradition held sway over cold, impersonal regulations. The conflict between the rigid order of the HOA and the wild, unbridled spirit of my homestead was about to come to a head. And as the days passed, it became clear that I was not going to let Karen Benson and her ilk trample on my rights without a fight. I resolved to take matters into my own hands, to reclaim what was mine and send a clear message that the freedom of the land was not for sale. The revelation that my carefully stacked firewood had vanished was more than a minor inconvenience. It was a provocation. I had worked hard all summer to collect that wood, chopping and splitting logs by hand, preparing for the inevitable chill of winter. To see it stolen, and to later learn through a whispering grapevine that Karen Benson was spotted near my property on several occasions, filled me with a mix of anger and determination. I began my investigation immediately. I combed through my security camera footage and, to my dismay, discovered clear images of a figure skulking near my woodpile on moonlit nights. The evidence was undeniable. Karen, with her determined stride and clipboard clutched tightly, had been sneaking onto my property. She must have thought that by removing my firewood, she could force me to conform to her idea of what a proper property should look like, or perhaps she was simply asserting her authority over the neighborhood. My first reaction was to confront the HOA board, demanding an explanation and the return of my stolen wood. But I quickly realized that Karen's influence ran deep. The board, steeped in tradition and often swayed by Karen's relentless reports, brushed off my concerns as trivial. We must maintain community standards, they insisted, citing vague guidelines about aesthetic harmony and proper property upkeep. It was clear that I was facing an uphill battle, a battle not just for my firewood, but for my right to live freely on my own land. Frustration soon gave way to resolve. I couldn't allow Karen's petty actions to go unchallenged, nor could I let the HOA continue to impose its arbitrary rules on my property. I decided then that I would send a message that was as creative as it was electrifying. I remembered that during one of my routine excursions in the woods, I had stumbled upon a naturally occurring colony of fire ants nestled inside a fallen log. The sight of those tiny creatures, fiercely defending their territory, sparked an idea in my mind. What if I could harness that natural force to exact a little poetic justice? I spent the next few days meticulously preparing my countermeasure. I gathered several logs from the edge of my property, logs that, with a little work, I could hollow out and fill with fire ants. I carefully selected the logs for their size and durability, ensuring they would look convincingly like part of my usual firewood stash. Then, using tools I'd honed over years of ranch work, I created small cavities inside each log, enough to house a thriving colony of fire ants without harming them, but plenty to ensure that when disturbed, they would swarm. I also rigged a simple, discreet mechanism that would release the logs onto my designated firewood pile at just the right moment. My plan was simple. When Karen, or any nosy neighbor, came snooping around my property, Expecting to find my neatly stacked firewood, they would instead encounter logs filled with nature's tiniest, yet fiercest, defenders. I knew that a few well-placed stings would be enough to serve as a powerful deterrent, and a potent symbol of my defiance. I began my covert operation under cover of dusk. With the precision of someone who had spent years working the land, I replaced the missing firewood with my specially prepared logs. I made sure to arrange them exactly as I had before, so that no one would suspect that a surprise lay hidden within. As I finished the final placement, a surge of adrenaline coursed through me. I knew that by morning, the truth would reveal itself in the most unexpected way. That night, as I lay awake in my modest farmhouse, I imagined the chaos that would erupt the next day. I pictured Karen, ever vigilant and overconfident, arriving with her clipboard and barking orders, only to be met with the swarming fury of fire ants. The thought brought a small, defiant smile to my face. This wasn't about petty revenge for a stolen pile of wood. It was about standing up for my rights and proving that my property, my legacy, was mine to command. In the back of my mind, I also knew that the digital evidence of Karen's repeated intrusions would soon resurface, bolstering my case and uniting my neighbors in support. My fight was no longer just a personal battle. It was a stand against the arbitrary imposition of rules by those who claimed to know what was best for everyone. The stage was set, the plan was in motion, and as dawn approached over Redwood Ridge, I braced myself for the moment when Karen's arrogance would finally be met with nature's indomitable force. When morning broke, the tranquility of Redwood Ridge was shattered by an unexpected scene. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, gathered near my property, their eyes wide with anticipation. I had arranged my firewood exactly as usual, but those who looked closer soon discovered something amiss. The logs, carefully placed where my stolen firewood once stood, had an unusual, almost eerie quality, a faint rustling sound and an uncharacteristic warmth that belied their ordinary appearance. It wasn't long before the first screams erupted. Karen Baxter, ever the vigilant enforcer, arrived on the scene with a furrowed brow and a determined stride, clipboard in hand. "What in the world is going on here?" she demanded, her voice rising in indignation as she inspected the pile. Her eyes widened in horror as she noticed that the logs were not filled with clean, dry wood, but were teeming with wriggling fire ants. The sight was surreal, a row of logs, each one alive with a bustling, angry swarm of tiny invaders. Within moments, pandemonium broke out. Neighbors gasped and pulled out their phones to capture the chaos. Some laughed in disbelief, while others called out in alarm as a few unlucky onlookers got too close and were swiftly greeted by the painful sting of fire ants. Karen's face turned an even deeper shade of red as she sputtered, "This is an outrage. Who would do such a thing?" I stepped forward, trying to maintain a calm composure despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "It seems you've stolen my firewood, Karen," I said evenly, so I replaced it with something a little more lively. The words, simple yet charged with defiance, rippled through the gathered crowd. The digital evidence of Karen's previous misdeeds had already begun circulating online, and this latest act of retribution was the spark that would ignite a full-blown revolt against the HOA's tyrannical methods. As Karen attempted to regain control of the situation, calling the HOA board and demanding that I remove the infestation, the chaos only grew. The fire ants, now disturbed by the commotion, began to spread beyond the logs, their tiny forms a living testament to the consequences of meddling with someone's property. Neighbors started to shout, some in support, others in fear, as the situation rapidly escalated from a minor prank into a neighborhood spectacle. Local authorities were soon alerted. A patrol car arrived, and an officer tried to restore order, but even he couldn't help but stifle a chuckle at the absurdity of it all. "Ma'am, please step back. This isn't an emergency," the officer said, his tone a mixture of amusement and professional concern. But Karen, red-faced and fuming, was in no mood to listen. "This is theft and vandalism," she shrieked, waving her clipboard as if it were a weapon. "I demand that you do something immediately." The digital footage, already spreading like wildfire on social media, captured every moment of the debacle. Hashtags such as hashtag FireAntRevenge, hashtag HOA Exposed, and hashtag Property Rights began trending locally, with residents and onlookers alike sharing their shock and support. What had started as a petty theft of firewood had now transformed into a full-scale community uprising against arbitrary enforcement and abuse of power. The tension was palpable as the day wore on. Neighbors who had once feared the repressive actions of the HOA now found themselves emboldened by the spectacle. A town hall meeting was hastily organized, and during that meeting, countless residents recounted similar stories of intrusive fines, baseless complaints, and the misuse of authority by those like Karen Baxter. The collective voice of the community grew louder, demanding accountability and calling for sweeping reforms. Amidst the chaos, I continued to document everything on my phone. Every video clip of the writhing, stinging ants, every anguished cry from a neighbor, every dismissive snarl from Karen was recorded as digital evidence. I knew that the coming days would see this evidence become a rallying point for a movement to ensure that private property rights would never again be trampled by petty bureaucrats. By late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent and the initial frenzy gave way to a more measured atmosphere, the HOA board announced that they would hold a final public hearing to address the incident and review their policies. The community was buzzing with anticipation, and the digital evidence had already united a majority of the residents in support of reform. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation, a moment when the collective will of the community would force a reevaluation of the long-standing, oppressive practices of the HOA. Every shared post, every hashtag, and every online comment reinforced the message that no one was above accountability, and that if you tried to impose your narrow vision on others, the repercussions would be swift and electrifying. The buzz in the neighborhood was palpable. This was not just about firewood or fire ants. It was about reclaiming our rights and our freedom to live as we choose. The turning point came on a brisk morning at the Oakwood Meadows Community Center, where the final public hearing was being held. The boardroom was packed with HOA officials, local police representatives, community leaders, and a diverse group of residents who had come to witness a pivotal moment for our neighborhood. With a calm but determined demeanor, Councilwoman Margaret Ellis stepped up to the podium. After an exhaustive review of all the digital evidence, eyewitness accounts, and community feedback, we have reached a conclusion that cannot be ignored. Councilwoman Ellis began, her voice clear and resolute. It is evident that the actions taken by Mrs. Karen Baxter, specifically the theft of firewood from a private property and the subsequent retaliatory actions, were not only unjustified, but were driven by personal bias and an abuse of power. This incident is a stark reminder that no one, regardless of their self-appointed authority, is above the law. A heavy silence fell over the room as Ellis continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board has resolved to rescind all fines and sanctions related to this incident and to launch a full disciplinary review of the practices that allowed such an abuse to occur. We will also be introducing new guidelines that respect the property rights of every resident in Oakwood Meadows. Her words reverberated through the room, and murmurs of approval began to build. At that moment, a longtime community advocate, respected for his unwavering commitment to justice, rose to speak. Today, we stand together to defend our rights as private property owners, he declared, his voice firm and impassioned. No resident should be subjected to arbitrary fines or have their property taken from them under the guise of community regulation. Let this public hearing be the turning point where we say, enough is enough. Our neighborhood must be a place of freedom, where creativity and individuality are celebrated rather than suppressed. His words were met with resounding applause, uniting everyone in a common cause. Following this, a senior officer from the local police department presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record of all digital footage, internal logs, and multiple eyewitness testimonies that documented every detail of the incident. The evidence was clear. My firewood had been deliberately stolen by Karen Baxter, and my subsequent countermeasure, installing logs filled with fire ants, was a direct, non-lethal response to reclaim my property rights. The Internal Affairs Panel unanimously supported strict disciplinary measures against those responsible for the theft and for enabling such arbitrary enforcement. Councilwoman Ellis concluded, "Let this resolution mark a new era for Oakwood Meadows, a community where every resident's rights are respected and where the abuse of power will be met with swift, decisive action." Today's vote is not merely about rescinding fines or reviewing policies. It is a declaration that our neighborhood stands for justice, individual freedom, and accountability. We will no longer tolerate actions that undermine our collective well-being. Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, sealed the turning point in our struggle for property rights. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with hope and determination, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and the unified voice of the community had forced a decisive change that would forever alter the way Oakwood Meadows was governed. The days of petty, arbitrary rule enforcement were over, and a future built on respect for individual property rights was finally within our grasp. In the weeks that followed the landmark decision, Oakwood Meadows underwent a transformation that resonated far beyond the boundaries of my property. News of the rescinded fines and the sweeping reforms announced by the HOA board spread rapidly, igniting passionate discussions about personal property rights, accountability, and the proper role of community governance. Local newspapers ran editorials with headlines such as "A New Dawn for Oakwood Meadows" and "Community United for Freedom," while social media buzzed with supportive hashtags like #PropertyRights and #NoMoreAbuse. Town hall meetings and community forums saw record attendance as residents gathered to share their experiences and envision a future free from arbitrary enforcement. Neighbors, who had long lived in fear of the HOA's intrusive policies, now spoke openly about their desire for a community where individuality was celebrated rather than stifled. We are no longer at the mercy of bureaucrats who see our property as nothing more than a canvas for their own narrow vision. One resident proclaimed at a bustling meeting, his voice filled with renewed hope. Within the reformed HOA board and the local police department, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, launched comprehensive training programs focused on ethical conduct, cultural sensitivity, and the respectful management of community resources. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary procedures were established to ensure that every complaint was handled fairly and that no resident would ever again suffer from arbitrary fines or invasions of privacy. Our duty is to protect the rights of every homeowner, and we are committed to doing so with integrity and fairness, declared Lieutenant Reed in a follow-up press conference. Community leaders and local civil rights organizations also mobilized to ensure that the lessons of this episode would lead to lasting change. Workshops, public forums, and educational campaigns were organized to promote awareness of individual rights and to empower residents to stand up against any form of overreach. When we unite as a community, our voices become the force that can reshape outdated systems. One local activist stated passionately during a town hall session, igniting applause from the gathered crowd. For me, the journey from confrontation to resolution was both personal and transformative. My decision to retaliate against Karen Baxter's theft by replacing my stolen firewood with logs filled with fire ants had not only reclaimed my property, but had also sparked a broader movement for accountability. Neighbors who had once felt powerless now found their voices, sharing their own stories of arbitrary fines and intrusive regulations. The digital evidence that had once exposed Karen's petty abuse became a symbol of resistance and a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the sanctity of private property. Karen Baxter, once the unchallenged enforcer of HOA rules, was now reduced to a cautionary tale. Digital records of her past misdeeds emerged, and many former supporters began to distance themselves. Her influence within Oakwood Meadows waned rapidly, and she became a symbol of everything that was wrong with unchecked authority. At a final celebratory event held in the community park, residents, local officials and community advocates gathered under the fading light of a setting sun. A large banner reading "Unity, Freedom, and Respect" was unfurled between towering oak trees, and heartfelt speeches echoed promises of a brighter, more inclusive future. Today, we celebrate our right to live free from arbitrary control, Councilwoman Ellis proclaimed, her voice resonating with determination. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation of our collective commitment to a future where every homeowner's rights were safeguarded. As each new day dawned over Oakwood Meadows, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how HOA Karen Baxter's theft of my firewood and my creative, ant-filled retaliation became a rallying cry for property rights reminded every resident that when a community stands together, no abuse of power can remain unchecked. Every sunrise carried with it the promise that in Oakwood Meadows, freedom, justice, and respect would always prevail. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more determined to defend our individual rights against any form of bureaucratic overreach. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Oakwood Meadows would forever be a place where creativity and independence were celebrated, a legacy built on the unyielding power of truth and community unity.